think about the way we regulate sex involving people who are incapable of consenting. So we do that in a couple of contexts. One is that we do it with respect to people who suffer from various mental disabilities, for example. So people who perhaps have dementia or suffer from more long-term kinds of mental disabilities as well. So take the case of the man in Iowa. He and his wife were very elderly. It was a second marriage for both of them. They both were widowed from their first marriages. And his wife, sadly, in her 70s, began to develop signs of dementia. And she was eventually institutionalized. And he continued, by all accounts, to have a very affectionate relationship with her, which seems to have involved some sexual activity. Her daughter from the first marriage was concerned about this and felt that it might not be in her mother's interest to continue those kinds of relations with her husband. So she reported it, and the man was ultimately prosecuted for engaging in sexual assault with his wife because the law deemed her to be incapable of consent given her mental disabilities. And the problem there is that while it's certainly true that people with disabilities are subject to a disproportionate amount of sexual abuse and they're especially vulnerable, we need to have laws that protect them. At the same time, if we enforce those laws too aggressively, or if we define incapacity in such a broad manner that it applies to anybody who suffers from a serious mental defect of one sort or another, then essentially we're effectively enforcing a kind of celibacy on such people. We're saying, well, nobody can have sex with you without incurring the possibility of a criminal punishment. So there you might say that the law is overbroad, and the conflict is very real because people who lack capacity in some sense nevertheless might wish to engage in sexual behaviors of various sorts. The same thing happens with the case of intoxication. Sometimes people get intoxicated precisely because they want to reduce their inhibitions and because they might want to engage in conduct that they wouldn't otherwise consent to if they were completely sober. So we need to be careful about overdrawing those kinds of laws in the interest of protecting people who might be potentially vulnerable without having such over-inclusive laws that at the same time we limit the ability for people to have consensual sex. An additional example is that we have some conduct that is now a crime, and we've talked about the possibility of decriminalizing it. So think about the practice of adult incest, for example. Some liberals would say that we should decriminalize adult incest because people are simply choosing the sexual partners that they wish to have, and so long as it's consensual, then we shouldn't really interfere with that. If an adult sibling wants to have sex with his brother or sister, then the law shouldn't really be involved in that, just as the law shouldn't be involved in cases where people want to have sex with same-sex partners or people who their family disapproves of. Well, that's fine. Perhaps we should decriminalize that kind of behavior, but the danger is that we might lose the ability to protect people who really are vulnerable. So if we find that the relationship between the brother and sister began when one of them was a minor, for example, it may be that on further examination we see that the conduct really is less consensual than we may have thought at the outset. So it's a fine balance between how do we find the right mix between that capturing the conduct that we want to capture without over criminalizing conduct that we might not think should be criminalized.